A lengthy process of translation. When we return, the saga of how the Bible as we know it today bridged the centuries en route to the modern age. Our quest for the origins of the Holy Book takes us back to the 4th century of the Common Era. Using Hebrew and Greek texts as his source, the religious scholar Jerome of Dalmatia translates the entire Bible into Latin, then the dominant language of the Roman Empire. Known as the Vulgate, Jerome's translation would become central to the growing young Christian church. At about the same time, elsewhere in the empire, important events contribute towards the ceaseless march of history. The people are recovering from a devastating plague of anthrax that has decimated the population. Soon the economy prospers under a new system of public taxation, and in the year 330, the emperor relocates his capital from Rome to Constantinople. Emanating from here, Christianity would soon thrive throughout the eastern flank of the empire. Long before the Bible took its familiar book form, it existed only in rolled parchment or papyrus manuscripts. Invented by the Egyptians during dynastic times, papyrus was the principal material used for writing documents and sacred texts throughout the Middle East. Made from the stem of a wild plant which grew in great abundance in the shallow waters of the Nile, the process of manufacture has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Most early biblical manuscripts were written on papyrus and then rolled up for storage. But as manuscripts became too long and cumbersome to be stored as scrolls, they were written on separate leaves bound together at the edges. Known as a codex, this was the forerunner of the modern book. One of the oldest ever found is the Aleppo Codex, discovered in the ruins of an ancient synagogue in Syria. Consisting of 760 pages, it was written in Hebrew more than 1,000 years ago and contains the entire text of the Old Testament.
This particular text is apparently mentioned by the medieval scholar Maimonides as being the most authoritative. It was missing for many, many years, somehow was recovered in Syria, and was smuggled by Syrian Jews out of the country after a fire destroyed part of it. And it is now in Israel.
Even older than the Aleppo Codex is a New Testament codex, written about 1,500 years ago. It was discovered at the isolated monastery of St. Catherine's, a Greek Orthodox church that nestles at the foot of Mount Sinai. According to tradition, the monastery was built on the site where Moses was first confronted by the presence of the divine in a burning bush, before being sent to redeem his people from slavery in Egypt. Known as the Codex Sinaiticus, the text is written entirely in Greek capital letters on heavy parchment or leather pages. It originally contained both Testaments, but some of the Old Testament pages were lost, and now only the New Testament remains complete. Now kept in London, it is one of the popular exhibits at the British Museum.
Because this manuscript was written in the middle of the 4th century, this is a lot later than the composition of the individual works. The earliest part of the Bible in the Old Testament may have been written 1,000 years earlier. There's no evidence in this manuscript about the authorship of any of the works. The real significance is in the continuing life of the Bible. So this is part of the chain.
Prior to the last 500 years, all Bibles were painstakingly copied by hand, usually by scribes in monasteries. Few people had access to the texts, which for centuries remained one-of-a-kind treasures in the possession of cathedral, church, and house of worship. Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press in the 15th century would eventually take the Bible out of the exclusive domain of church and synagogue and place it in the hands of the common man. But the history of the church has often been a tempestuous one, and the Bible would still undergo many stages of development. Not long after the invention of the printing press, the German monk Martin Luther nails his list of grievances against the Catholic Church to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, ushering in the Reformation and the eventual founding of the Protestant Church. To encourage the breakaway movement, Luther also translates the Bible into German. The holy texts first appeared in the English language some 600 years ago. In England, a version of both testaments is completed by John Wycliffe and his assistants in the 14th century. The work is based on a meticulous translation from the Vulgate by Jerome, but the Church still frowns upon any form of deviation from Latin, and Wycliffe is eventually branded a heretic. His Bibles are condemned, and years after his death, his body is exhumed and burned. In the 16th century, William Tyndale produces an English translation based on Greek texts, but he too is labeled a heretic and executed. Readers of later English Bibles owe more to Tyndale than to any other person in history, for over 80% of his translation would ultimately be incorporated into the King James Authorized Version. Under King Henry VIII, in 1533, England severs its long-held ties with the Catholic Church in Rome, and the Anglican Church comes into being. The king orders a new official English translation of the Scriptures, resulting in the Great Bible of 1539. This massive book, with pages measuring 15 by 9 inches, is printed in large quantities and distributed throughout the realm. Under Elizabeth I, the Geneva Bible is published a couple of decades later. This is the first English Bible to have verse numbers, and so many copies are printed that it soon becomes known as the Bible of the People. It is also the Bible of Shakespeare and of the pilgrims who set sail in the Mayflower to cross the Atlantic and colonize the New World. In 1604, King James I orders that a new version of the Bible be produced based on ancient Hebrew and Greek texts. After more than 2 centuries of exhaustive revisions and reprints, the so-called King James Authorized Version finally makes its appearance, giving the English-speaking world the most widely used Bible of all time. By the 20th century, many people believed that all had been learned of the mysterious hands that set down the greatest words ever written. But this may not be so. Despite the clues that science and scholarship have uncovered thus far, we are still left with a plethora of unanswered questions. When we return, a probe into the Bible's ancient heartbeat, into the nature...
Department 15, Richmond, Virginia 23280, or order online at timelife.com.
Our quest for clues regarding the authorship of the Bible has revealed the hand of man in the process, but many mysteries yet remain. With all the secrets unveiled by scholarly inquiry thus far, there are those who remain convinced that God himself was responsible for much or all of Holy Scripture. This belief applies essentially to those most ancient of the texts, the Hebrew Torah, or the 5 books of Moses. While evidence exists at a few archaeological sites that Hebrew may have developed from the languages of ancient Canaan and Phoenicia some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, some believe that its origins are more mystical, that its source